And we are live.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming to our youth subcommittee meeting. First, I would like to introduce Police Chief Justin Pius to the group. Chief, this is Jamil and Sammy. They're both members of the Community Task Force and a part of our youth subcommittee. So first, Jamil or Sammy, do one of you mind motioning to accept the minutes from last week?
Motion.
So all in favor?
Aye.
All right, great. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Chief Pius. Chief, if you want to maybe just introduce yourself and introduce maybe what the department does in the DEI space, and then I'm sure Jamil and Sammy will have some good questions for you.
Great. Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate you guys inviting me. I'm glad we're able to get a little bit of time and space away from the regular community task force meeting so we can have some space to talk about what questions you might have, specifically tonight about the police department. So I'll share a little bit of background on myself. My name is Justin Pius. I'm the chief of police here in Dublin. I've worked for the city of Dublin for the last 17 years. I've been here with the police department since 2003, had a number of roles and assignments throughout my career here with the police department, and I became the chief of police in June of 2019. I actually grew up around law enforcement. My dad was a police officer in the state of Ohio, actually retired after 37 years in the state of Ohio as a police officer as the chief of police in Perrysburg, Ohio, which is on the south side of Toledo, in the Toledo area. After graduating from high school up in the Toledo area, I went to Bowling Green State University and got my degree in criminal justice. And a week after I finished my degree in criminal justice, I started my first job in policing. So right as a 21-year-old kid, fresh out of college, got an opportunity to start in policing in Oregon, Ohio, which is on the east side, up in the northeast side of the Toledo area. 2003, I got a call from a lieutenant who worked here who's actually still with our organization. He's actually our crime analyst after he retired as an officer, came back to us and it still works for us as a crime analyst. But he gave me a call at the time. He was the lieutenant. He actually worked with my dad in a small town where I grew up in Willard, Ohio. And so they worked together. My dad was actually his field training officer. And when I became a police officer, I'd been a police officer for about 3 years. He gave me a call and said Dublin was testing, and I came down here and took the test, and I've been here the last 17 years. So personally, I've got 5 kids. 2 of them have graduated from Scioto High School. One's an education major up in Bowling Green, and the other is over in Dayton as an engineering major. I've got 3 more that are still at Scioto High School, and one's a junior, and then we have twins that are freshmen at Scioto this year. Happy for them to have gone back and get a little normalcy back in their life and seeing some of their classmates again. My wife, she is a nurse. She is a nurse manager at Riverside Hospital. She works for the NICU unit at Riverside Hospital. It's actually a children's unit, but at Riverside and Ohio Health at the facility there. So we've lived in Dublin, like I said, the last 17 years. We're members of St. Bridget. Our kids have been through Dublin City Schools. I've been blessed to work for the city of Dublin for the last 17 years. And I always tell people for all of the things and benefits and blessings our family has received working here in Dublin, I'll spend the rest of my career trying to repay a debt I owe and frankly, never make a dent in it, but I will do everything I can to try to pay forward everything we've had in blessing and being here in this community. From the police department perspective, we're broken down into 3 separate and distinct units. We have 121 total employees. 72 of those employees are sworn police officers. The other bulk of our staff are in our communication section. We run the first section I'll talk about is our Technical Services Bureau. That is our dispatch center. So our dispatch center is a consolidated dispatch center. So when you call 911, or even if you call a non-emergency number looking to get the police department, it would come into our dispatch center, the Northwest Regional Communication Center. And they actually dispatch for Dublin Police, Washington Township Fire here locally, but they also dispatch for Hilliard Police Department and Norwich Fire in the Hilliard area, Upper Arlington Police and Fire, and then Worthington Police and Fire. So that group dispatches and takes 911 calls for 4 separate communities and 8 total public safety entities. So that's the bulk of our Technical Services Bureau. In that bureau as well, there's also our records section. So we have a records window that is open Monday through Friday from 8 in the morning till 5 p.m., where people can come and get reports that have been filed. They can come and file a report actually at that window, and the other portion of that function is our property section, which is a civilian employee who takes care of all the property that we impound here at the department as well. The other piece within that Technical Services Bureau, and we can talk a little bit more about this later as we talk about police standards, is our accreditation office. And so we have an accreditation manager that runs our accreditation process for our sworn police process and also for our communication center. We're accredited through the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, CALEA, which is an international law enforcement accreditation. It's done by a third party who comes in and takes a look at our policies and our procedures and practices to make sure that we are up to date with the best practices in law enforcement, make sure that we can prove that we're following the policies that we set in front of us. So that's our Technical Services Bureau. There are two other sections within our organization we break down into. Both of them are over our sworn functions. The first is our operations section, which is our patrol section. So what you think of when you think about the police department: 24 hours coverage, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We have officers out and available patrolling in the city. So our operations section covers that patrol section. Our patrol shifts are broken down into 8 hours per shift. So they start from our earliest shift starts at 7 in the morning until 3 p.m. The next shift comes on right at 3 p.m. until 11. And then we have an overnight shift that works from 11 p.m. until 7 in the morning. So each of those shifts have a different level of officers that are assigned to that shift because of the type of call and the volume of calls that we have on those shifts. But we have coverage 24 hours a day, and then 9 supervisors, 3 per shift, that oversee those shifts as well. And that's our operations section. And then the last section of our department is our support services unit. And that the 3 units that are in that support services function are our detective bureau. So we have a set of detectives that handle investigations that are more complex, but also anything that requires a report gets followed up on by our agency. So those detectives take and sort of are the clearinghouse for all the reports on crime that we take throughout the year that get assigned. So they, and in addition to that, when we have major crimes, they're the officers, detectives that go out to the scene and process those investigations, do the interviews for those major crimes. We also have another investigative section within the support services, our community impact unit. And in that section, we have uniformed traffic enforcement officers. So they handle our neighborhood traffic complaints. They handle traffic enforcement on our freeways, on our highways, and through sort of maintenance areas throughout the city where we typically get complaints of either reckless operation or high speeds. They'll address those, and they move our speed trailers around, so they have that function. And then we have a set of investigators that are not detectives, but are more proactive in their investigation. So they handle sort of our vice activities, including our drug offenses that get reported to us, or issues of vice, maybe at our hotels if there are reports of prostitution or human trafficking that are occurring. They would go out and work those investigations. So sometimes before we would even get a offense report that would be filed, they would be paying attention to those kinds of activities and making sure that they're proactively dealing with those issues. And then the last section, which you guys are probably the most familiar with in that support services, is our community education unit and our school resource officers. So we probably have one of the largest or larger school resource officer programs in the area, outside of maybe the program that Columbus used to have. So we have 7 officers assigned to our school resource officer program, 1 in each of the high schools, and then 4 that are assigned to our middle schools. And then we have 2 supervisors that work with that unit as well. So that's sort of the breakdown and structure of our organization. And I guess I'll pause there if you guys have any questions, but I'll take you through a little more if you want me to just lay sort of the foundation of, again, what we do and how we direct our activities. Any questions so far?
I just had a question about like the chief police task force. You guys, like, what are you guys working on or like doing over there? You should probably know about.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking. So as you guys know, the Community Task Force and the Chiefs Advisory Committee were enacted both at the same time in August through the resolution. Both of them started at the same time, and we meet monthly just as the task force meets on a regular basis. So what we really have talked about so far, the first topic that, and tying back into the last piece I explained about our department, the topic we have spent the most time speaking about with the advisory committee has been the school resource officers. So just following up on both some of the conversations we were having over the summer, when there were protests in our community and other communities, and then following up on some of the threads that were created for students and young leaders talking about what they wanted to see as progress in the community. School resource officers was, and the school system was a hot topic that we heard as a community we needed to lean into. So that was the first topic we really started with, and we spent, I'm going to say, our first 5 meetings really just trying to lay foundation for the conversations we were going to have. And the first topic we really sat down in for at least 3, if not 4 of those meetings was the school resource officer program. So we sent them some information to help give them some understanding of what we do currently and to help inform any recommendations that they might be giving us in their reflection of what we're doing and things that they might want to see us do with the school resource officer program. So we sent them the SRO manual and the contract. We sent them our policy on the SROs. Actually, what we did for a couple meetings was we had SROs come in and speak and answer questions for the members of the advisory committee as well, to give them what it looks like on a typical day, what it looks like from some of their community education functions, and then just to answer any questions that the advisory committee had about their role in the school system and what that looks like for them functioning as a member of our agency. The next set of conversations that we've sort of moved into, the advisory committee has asked us to bring back policies for some very specific activities that we're engaged in, and they're really the topical conversations that we're having about policing in general right now in America. So our response to resistance policy, our use of force policy, is one that we just started talking about during our last meeting, and we'll pick up that conversation on Thursday this week to talk a little more in depth. Rendering aid after a response to resistance was a policy that they wanted to see. We have a specific policy directing that activity for us as well. Officer-involved critical incidents, which used to be titled our officer-involved shooting or officer-involved officer-involved critical incident is the title of it now. So that's a policy that they wanted to have some discussion about. They wanted to talk about body cameras and our policy on body cameras, which we have body cameras for all of our officers in Dublin. They wanted to know what our policy looks like and just talk through that. And then the other topic was response to civil disturbances or crowd control, and our policy on responding to large crowds was the other policy that we will get into. Frankly, that will probably take us through, I'm going to guess, into the fall in having those conversations. So a little different than the community task force conversations, where there is sort of a deadline to be met on the report back to council come August. The advisory committee will be a standing committee, so there isn't a end date for the committee. It'll be in existence, as long as we have community members who are interested in staffing it. That's something we intend to continue well into the future. Because as we have conversations about our policies, we're always looking at updating our policies. And I talked a little bit about our accreditation process. The hope for that process is to give us an opportunity to continually review what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and then make sure our policies are reflective not just of past practice, how we've done it before, but best practice. So if that means we need to change and adapt our policies to meet community expectations, community needs, or trends in law enforcement that are the best practices, then that's what we would want to do, which is why we want to keep that conversation ongoing with the advisory committee. Does that answer sort of that information? Good. Any other questions? I don't want to miss an opportunity. I'll stop because I'll talk on forever because I love what I do. But I want to make sure that while we're here together, you guys get a chance to ask your questions as well.
One more regarding SROs or student research officers. You mentioned how like all officers, are they required to like have them on at all times, and does that include the student resource officer?
Great question. Great question. They are not required to have the body cameras on at all times. As a matter of fact, they would only turn them on when they are capturing a law enforcement activity. If they're doing an interview, if they're taking a report, if they're investigating an incident, they would turn it on, but they are not running for the vast majority of the time that the SROs are in the school. I do not expect that they would be running. It would only be when they are taking police action or involved in a police activity or response that they would turn that body camera on. And we were careful to navigate that because what we don't want to do is then have one. From just a logistical standpoint, the storage in capturing all that video of a 8-hour period, but also we wanted to be sensitive to, we're only going to turn it on the occasions where the SROs are engaged. And again, that law enforcement perspective where they're actually doing an investigation or handling an incident.
So if I could just jump in here, my question is about body cameras as well. So are they, you said for the SROs, they're not consistently on. Are they consistently on for officers that are in traffic patrol or responding to any kind of scene? The reason that I ask is because a lot of the major events that we've seen recently, there have been issues with body cams not being turned on. And I was just wondering what our policies and what our procedures look like to ensure that those body cameras actually record critical incidents.
That's a great question. So no, they're not on all of the time when an officer is patrolling, but there are some automatic triggers where the body camera does turn on. Now, anytime an officer has contact for an investigation, an investigatory stop, if they're making a traffic stop, if they are taking a report, they're responding to an incident, they're required to activate their body camera. But if they're just in their car or they're here on station and they're talking with other officers, they're not capturing video all the time. The body camera itself is always, once it's turned on, always running. It's when they hit the button and turn it on actively that it begins to mark an event. So the cameras themselves have a capacity to go back and for us to go back and capture the video, but it's not actually marking event until the officer, it's running, but until they hit the button that starts to record. And what it does is it just overwrites the space on the drive itself, and then when you get to a point where you mark it, it captures that event and then takes that portion and saves it. When they come back in and dock that camera, then it uploads the video. But there are some automatic triggers as well. So an officer responding to an emergency call, when they activate their lights and siren to respond, their camera in their car immediately starts and the body camera starts as well. So there's an automatic trigger so that they don't have to, in an emergency circumstance, jump out and then remember, also, I have to hit the button. So our expectation is that officers are using it to record their activities. You make a great point and question on how do we know they're capturing a critical incident. We do audit our incidents for incidents of use of force, pursuits, and then anything that would be a complaint. Those would all a complaint filed where somebody has a question about what an officer did or concern about what an officer did. We review body camera video from those incidents to make sure we're taking a look at it from as much of the perspective as we possibly can, either captured from the cruiser or captured from the body camera. And if there are concerns about whether or not an officer did activated it when they should or didn't get it activated at all, then we address that in corrective action with the officer. And over the course of 2 years, I'm only aware of 4 incidents where somebody forgot or didn't get it activated. And on all 4 of those events, when we identified, we took corrective action, but also it was captured by somebody else's camera or it was captured by the cruiser camera. So while the officer, and we had to address that the officer didn't activate it on those occasions, there were really training issues. On one occasion, I'll give you an example. It was the body camera didn't sync with the car, so they turned their lights and siren on, their camera started, but because it didn't sync before they took off from their shift that day, it didn't activate the body camera, and the officer thought it had turned it on. Fortunately, in that incident, the cruiser camera captured it, so we had everything that occurred on camera, and the other officer's body camera captured it as well. But we still actually went back and addressed that with the officer, so they understood this is the importance of making sure that it syncs and that we're capturing everything we should with the body camera moving forward. But that's sort of a quick overview of our body camera program. We've had them, we started the program, I think in 2017 with a pilot and spent a year just with a handful of officers learning as much as we could about different systems of body cameras. So we chose one that ultimately worked what we felt like was the best for us. And in that time, we were able to also reconcile the cameras in the cruiser needed to be changed out because they had been in existence for a time where the technology needed to be upgraded. So we were able to bring both sets of cameras in at the same time, and they're all on the same system. So when we look at a video on our computer afterwards, we can actually see both the cruiser camera and the body camera on at the same time, so we can see as much as you can from a desk removed, a couple days after an event, be able to see exactly as much as we see as much as we possibly can of the event to make sure everything went as we would have hoped during the incident.
Thank you. That answered my question. It sounds like you're creating a culture of review and also placing a lot of importance on this body cameras, which is very good to hear.
Yeah, and the conversation you hear in the public is absolutely right. I mean, it's not a cheap technology. We're very fortunate to have, in every regard, the support we have from the community members here in Dublin to be able, and that's not just support for us, it's sort of in what we're doing, but also the financial support to be able to purchase the technology and equipment that we need to do our jobs, but also those pieces of accountability that are important for the public to be able to see their police department in action. And so and the reason that I point that out is there may be communities who you wonder, why don't they have body cameras? Why doesn't every community have a body camera? Every officer in the state of Ohio have a body camera? Because it can be an expensive endeavor. And you have communities that have police departments where there are only a handful of officers that work at that department. And so most of our budget, for an operating budget, about 92% of it goes towards the officer's salary and benefits. There's a very small amount of operating budget that's left, and it's not a small amount of money. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we're well taken care of in being able to afford the technology, as evidenced by our investment in body cameras. But there's sometimes a department in an organization or in a city that maybe doesn't have the funding that it would like. Maybe they have to make the determination: are we going to add more officers to help with our protection of the community and service of the community, or are we going to forego maybe other resources to put that towards a technology that that the public wants, but it is going to come at sort of a give and take of what financial resources we have to be able to do everything we would like to as a department or community. Again, very blessed and fortunate to work for Dublin and to have that sort of forward thinking that we got a chance not only to move towards body cameras, we had a whole year and the public's patience in waiting through. Let's take a look at what body camera system is right for us to make sure we're investing in the right technology so that we're not continually having to buy or update technology in the future. We can commit to this for a period of time, and then as we project forward, consider where will technology be 5, 6, 7 years down the road when we need to replace it and move on to something new.
So I have one follow-up question to that. If you had a second instance or a body cam was not properly activated and you've issued one corrective action plan, like would it just depend on the incidents as to perhaps why that happened a second time? And would the recourse be the same or just something you have to look into further?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would depend on the circumstances. So, I mean, if it were repeated and we'd had the conversation with an officer and they were just, and this doesn't happen, regularly, but if they were repeated and we've already given somebody sort of notice, this is how you need to take care of it, we've retrained somebody, then that could progress in discipline or progress to discipline, depending on where we started initially. There are occasions where, and again, we're learning some of what we're with the body camera still is new technology relatively to, in the last couple of years to our agency. There are events we hope we never have. So, knowing and seeing everything as a police department takes time. But our hope would be that with corrective action initially, we wouldn't see that repeated. But if it required us addressing it again, we may have to go through a progressive discipline based on what we're experiencing. But it would be based on the circumstances or the events that have occurred as well. That's a great question, though. And it's certainly, this is why I love having conversations with, with people who help us think through, maybe there's something better that we could do with our policy to make it more clear, or maybe we just need to be more open and spend time talking about our policy and programming. I will tell you that with some technologies, we thought we were going to get questions from the public, and it never really presented in the same way. But that doesn't mean, in retrospect, I wouldn't go back and say, well, let's find the venue to have that conversation, even if the public isn't asking that question. And so much of the last 8, 9, 10 months of conversations that we have had been us really considering, have we done our due diligence in all directions to be able to explain what police officers do and why they do it? Most people don't have the occasion to meet a police officer, spend time with a police officer. If you've, and I don't know if either one of you have ever had contact or conversation with our SROs just as they're in the school, and I hope you have. But if you consider most agencies in the last couple of years, most communities were still building school resource officer programs. They hadn't had anything before, but they were looking at adding that as a component of their organization to connect to students. Most people don't grow up the way I did, where you had a chance to. I spent every day of my life with with a police officer at home and around a lot of officers, and my kids have known that experience growing up as well. But for people who haven't, there may be, as a curiosity at the very least, it concerns certainly for some members of the community. I don't know what a police officer does. I don't know why they do it. I've never met with a police officer before. And all that I know or see about law enforcement are things that I've seen in the news, or things that, that I've seen maybe on my social media. And I don't know why it happened. All I know is I hope that never happens to me. And so from that perspective, it's really our obligation as practitioners in law enforcement, as public safety servants, to find ways to actively have that conversation and communication before it's an event that somebody is experiencing for the first time in dynamic circumstances. So if you think of the occasions where somebody might need a police officer, they're either calling because they're going to file a report, which is, if you had something stolen from, let's say, your vehicle, which is the #1 report typically that we have as far as crime in the city of Dublin, that's a pretty traumatic experience for somebody who's just lost their property. And even if an officer is polite and professional, and I expect them to be, by the way, but when they show up and they're polite and professional and they're helpful, it's really not conducive to you having a full conversation with the officer about who they are, what they do, and why they do it. You just know, my stuff is missing. Is there any way you can get it and get it back for me, or figure out who took it? It's really not the place to have that full conversation. Or you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you hear the lights and siren behind you and you think, I don't even know what I just did, but this is all an overwhelming experience, because a traffic stop is, for most people, maybe the only occasion they're going to get to have a conversation. But again, not conducive to having a full conversation about who that person is, what they do, and why they do it. So creating intentional venues is really on us to have that communication with community members for 2 reasons. One, so we can share what we do, why we do it, and then hope to get to the point where we can share who we are and why we got into this. But also for community members to ask questions, and for us to hear, what are the expectations that our community has of our service? What are the things that we are doing that maybe aren't resonating with community members the way we hoped or intended? And how do we tweak those things so that we are delivering on what expectations are currently and what they're going to be in the future, which is why a venue like this is so important.
One more question. Would you mind explaining how what you guys do at police officer training, and how that would help prevent incidents from happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So somebody like me who comes out of college and has a degree in criminal justice, that does not qualify me to be a police officer in the state of Ohio, even a 4-year degree. I have to go to a police academy in order to be able to get certified as a peace officer in the state of Ohio. That's the actual certificate that you get from the Ohio Peace Officers Training Academy. So any officer that comes to us, it starts with a basic foundation of training if they've never been an officer anywhere else at an academy. We happen to send our new members who have not been certified yet to the Columbus Police Academy, where they go through, I think it's up to 7 months of training, 5 days a week, through the training with the academy, with other cadets that are there from Columbus and from other suburban agencies. So they actually get to meet and have that experience with colleagues from other neighboring agencies as they go through that. Anybody who goes through the academy, or anybody who starts with us who already has experience, then goes through an extensive field training program with our agency. And our field training program, in addition to that 7 months that you would have gone through the police academy, gotten certified as a peace officer, you would then go through another 4 months of training with us, where we would pair you with several field training officers in our organization in distinct phases as you would go through your training. So it would start with us, again, laying the foundation, even if you've already had it in the academy, with the expectations we have as an organization on how the job is going to be done here in Dublin. So we would go through the firearms training and defensive tactics training as part of it, just to make sure everybody is proficient in, even if they've already been certified in the academy, with what we would want them to be here in our organization. Then we would have 2 weeks of classroom training, and the classroom training is them not out in a car. It's here in the building with the field training officer, going through that with them, all of the policies and procedures that are important for that officer to understand, so that they know exactly what the expectations are before they ever even enter a cruiser and are out patrolling in our community. As they move from the classroom phase, those first 2 weeks, then they would spend their first phase of training in our training program. The first week of that training would be them just riding along in uniform with a field training officer. They're not the primary contact, they're just observing the field training officer, so they have an opportunity just to acclimate to the community and be in a car out patrolling on one of our shifts. After that phase, then they would move into being the officer as the primary contact, but they would still have that field training officer with them. And after each individual call, they would spend time with that field training officer talking about what went well, what things they need to improve on, what things that they can think through, and how to handle that report and make sure everything gets documented, it gets sent to the right direction to who's going to follow up on it. And so that phase then will also include a training day where we would take them out of normal patrol capacity and expose them to training scenarios. So things that we may not experience here in Dublin regularly, but we would not want them patrolling on their own until we gave them an opportunity in a controlled environment to respond to, so that we can assess, are they making the right decisions in approaching this particular incident, whether that be a theft incident, a domestic violence call, a traffic crash, or a critical incident. Are they getting a chance to walk through what they would do, but in a controlled situation where we can stop and pause and give direction or correction on helping them progress and grow as an officer? That's just one phase or 1 month. After that phase, they would get an entire new FTO on a separate shift and go through all of that then again with another training day, another shadow day, and then a regular feedback from their field training officer. That goes through 3 phases. So they would transition to a new FTO in each phase. And then finally, in the 4th phase, they would go back to their original field training officer. They would spend time with that training officer, where the training officer would be in not in a uniform capacity. They would be just in plain clothes, but would still be in the car with them to give them that same guidance and feedback. But they would be expected to essentially be operating as if they're completely on their own. So they're the primary handling all of the calls themselves. If we are comfortable after that 4th phase, then the training officer, the sergeant for the training program, the lieutenant over the operations bureau, and I would all have to sign off on letting that officer progress to solo patrol, and then they would be through the training program and out patrolling by themselves. But if you go all the way back to, again, 7 months in the academy, 4 months in field training, you're looking at almost an entire year before an officer gets to be out on their own patrolling by themselves. And the point is, 2 ways to look at it, and both are equally important. One of it is us having confidence that the officer knows everything that they need to and has been exposed to as much as we possibly can, that we're comfortable they will be able to hit all of the expectations we have for any of our officers patrolling. But equally for them, that they have the confidence that they go out there and the first day they're patrolling by themselves, I cannot control what's going to be thrown at them that first day out there. So it's to your question, how do we know that we have prepared as best we can so that we're avoiding as much as we possibly can of hardship for the officer and for the individual who needs help out there in the community? It's, again, spending that time to intentionally walk and give confidence to the officer that they can handle whatever is thrown at them as far as a call for service. Beyond that, each year we have in-service training twice a year. So in the fall, we actually have 2 weeks of in-service training where every member of our organization, including me, go through training again on all of those things that are foundational to us in being able to respond as officers and meet all the expectations. So we have a legal update with our legal staff who come in and gives us an overview of case law and the best practices based on case law and the things we need to be aware of to make sure that we are staying within the confines of what case law has now dictated is appropriate procedure. We also go back and do the fundamentals of our defensive tactics is a great example of something we would go back and revisit to make sure officers know how to keep themselves safe and keep others safe. And part of the important piece in that defensive tactics is not just how to do the things, but what is the appropriate level of response based on the situation you are given. So much like I talked about the scenario training and field training, when we unplug and do that in-service training for all members of the organization, it's a review of the policy, it's a talk about best practices and training from our in-house trainers on what they have seen in their reviews of our response to resistant use of force incidents and what we need to get more proficient at or be prepared to be able to do to keep everyone safe. And then we are given scenarios that are the role actors are trainers, and we're thrown into scenarios that are based on things we have experienced either here in Dublin in the past or things that we have seen in other agencies to make sure we're getting to have the conversation with officers about appropriate level of response in dealing with a sometimes dynamic encounter with somebody who is either resisting or we need to take into custody to keep them safe as well. So those are some of the ways that we continue to, again, always be thinking of how do we train better, how do we give officers better guidance in our policy to make sure we are doing everything we can to bring any situation to safe conclusion as quick as we possibly can with this minimal amount of if force is necessary to use in each situation to keep everybody safe. I know that's a lot too, but I wanted to sort of give the picture of how intentional we are at making sure we commit to that. And I'll talk a little bit. I mean, if one of the questions that we get from and we've had from the advisory committee is how many incidents of use of force do we have? And in any given year, we typically have between 15 to 19 incidents where an officer may have a response to resistance or use force. But the vast majority of those are people we are trying to take into custody, and they are either actively resistant or actively combative with us, and it's their takedowns is by far the most frequent use of force in our review of our incidents, and that's just simply taking somebody to the ground so that we can stabilize and handcuff it from that position. So this last year is a great example. We had we do a review too of each incident. Every time that occurs, a supervisor has to go out to the scene and take photographs, take witness statements, speak to the witnesses and speak to the person that we've used force on, get a statement from the officer. That then investigation goes to our defensive tactics coordinator so they can review it and make sure that whatever the officer did was in line with our policies, procedures, and their training. That comes back to the shift supervisor, who then has to write a memo reviewing all of the body camera, the statements, the photographs, the memos from the investigating supervisor and from the defensive tactics coordinator, and then write a separate memo that says whether or not it was in line with our policies and procedures. That review then goes to the bureau commander, who then reviews all of that information again, and then it finally comes to me. So each incident is reviewed at that many levels to make sure we're paying attention and focusing on us doing exactly what we're supposed to do. At the end of the year, we take all of the incidents that we have reviewed, and our crime analyst then looks at all of that information and does an analysis of what we have seen as far as the incidents, what we have seen as far as the officers' actions, and then we take that information and that analysis, and the trainers use that to guide the training they're going to give us in the following year, because it is based on what we've experienced in the past. So we are cleaning up any issues maybe that we could have done better, and also sharing the experience, because with only 15 that happen in a year, you may go there are some officers who maybe have not even had a use of force event in their career. So we want to make sure, we certainly don't want that to happen, but we also don't want to wait for that to happen for an officer to take into consideration, what would I do in this situation? So that information from the analysis then becomes a information that helps guide the trainers in presenting those scenarios for us during our in-service training in the future. But last year is a really good example. We had 15 incidents. Most of them, I think 13 of the 15 then were resolved with officer takedown. We had 2 instances of a taser report being filed where the taser was not actually deployed, it was just turned on. So we didn't even have a deployment of taser where somebody actually sent probes out as part of it. They just turned it on and said, and gave commands with the taser out, but we still track and make sure that officers are reporting that so that we can take into consideration, are we using that appropriately, and then analyzing that as part of our use of force analysis as well. But we're always looking to, again, improve on the training that we are engaged in. And the important piece, again, back to the training on our response to resistance, those scenarios don't always end with us having to use force. The trainers do a good job. If you're able to navigate a scenario through de-escalation, that's the right answer. And that's the right answer in the vast majority of the contexts we have. Being able to talk to somebody and get them to a point where they are voluntarily complying with us and working through that, and letting time and space and distance work for us and in our favor, that's part of that training as well. So it doesn't always end with us using an implement from our belt to be able to resolve the situation. As a matter of fact, like I said, most of them are if they progress to a point where it's a use of force at all, it's us then just taking control of the person and then putting them in a position of stabilizing them on the ground so we can handcuff, because we're responding to that resistance. And so, I mean, that's sort of an overview of that practice for us, and that training, and then our review process as well.
Cindy,
To kind of go
do you
in
have
a
question?
to kind of go in a different direction, I had a question about SROs, or in the schools, because one thing we talked about in the task force, how to get involved with kids like before middle and high school. I was just wondering if there's any like thought or like plan to like expand the program to the elementary schools, even though I know there's like 15 of them, so it might be a little hard.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, it's funny because we had that conversation, and I think from the advisory committee early on, one of the questions and considerations for them once they heard what we do as a program is they wondered why we were even at the elementary school. So the SROs have assigned elementary schools that they travel to as well. So, and I'll give you an example. My kids came up through Daniel Wright, and then we're at Davis, and then we're at Scioto. And we have an officer who visits there on occasion to go and talk with kids and just be present in the school so that young kids can see an officer, meet an officer. They don't have as many programs as they do in the middle school and high school, but it really is just an opportunity for us to spend some time with students there who are in schools that we also are concerned about making sure that we have an awareness of how to help either the teachers there keep everyone safe, or just meet and talk to kids there. And so one of the programs that we recently so one of the supervisors that is a supervisor over the community education unit also has responsibility for our community liaison officers and our diversity and inclusion initiatives. And so one of the partnering groups we started working with is the Starfish Assignment, and they have a book reading program where they provide the books, and then an officer goes and reads in the classroom to young students, and then we give the students the books that we are going to go and read. So, and I'm excited because they've scheduled me to go back to Daniel Wright Elementary and go back right to where my kids all went to elementary school. And so I'll get an opportunity to go and read to students there, just as I once did when my kids were there and I got to come into the class. So I couldn't be more excited, to go back and to see students there. And again, my kids have all gone through, the school system here. And the reason my daughter's an education major, I always tell the teachers, is because we have such a fantastic school system and such wonderful teachers who have inspired her to figure out, how do I want to give back to my community in my adult life? And she wants to teach. So, to be able to partner with a group who is focused on, again, meeting with the elementary school kids, but also us going in and being able to provide a resource for students as part of that book initiative is something that we're working on in the future as well.
So obviously not everybody has come into contact with diversity and confronting diversity and some of the implications in our society of diversity and implicit bias. How's that taught within the Dublin Police Department?
Yeah, so this last 8 months has really been a good opportunity for us to lean into and think about, how do we continue to build a culture where we have an understanding of implicit bias and what that means for our operations and activities. So this year, I reached out to a consultant from actually the Perrysburg area, the Toledo area, and he was a law enforcement officer in Louisiana. And he was also in the military. So his background sort of is conducive to being able to come and teach officers. But in his doctorate work, he studied implicit bias and the impact of implicit bias training, specifically with law enforcement agencies. And so I reached out to him, and actually in August, we had all of our officers go through a information session and a foundational training session with him on implicit bias, in understanding the concept and starting to lay the foundation as we move forward. Continue to look for what's the next evolution then of our training with our officers to open an awareness and conversation and discussion about issues of race, about issues of race as it affects policing practices in America, and what that means to us here in Dublin, in our understanding of how to lean in and be more aware of our diverse community, to be more responsive to minority communities and their experience with policing. I mean, the truth of the matter is that we have to not just lean into the conversation, but find the right progress for us to be in better position for our officers to be able to engage and to respond and deliver protection and service with empathy and compassion and understanding, which they are all willing to do. It's just, how do we lay the right foundation for what that understanding looks like? So one of the other contacts that we've made over the last several months, so Ohio State University and the Kirwan Institute on Race and Diversity is in their training coordinator, somebody I've reached out to have conversation with. They're still not doing training in person, but it is one of the opportunities I think we'll have in the future to, again, continue to push ourselves in a better understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, better training foundation for our officers to give them the right tools that they need to be able to, again, deliver protection and service to all members of our community and anyone who comes through our community, because it's not just our population that we service here in Dublin. We have a lot of commuters that come to our town for business. There are a lot of hotels where people are traveling and staying in the community of Dublin, and we have a lot of highway there that members who maybe aren't even stopping in Dublin, but maybe stopped by us in Dublin. And we just need to make sure we have a growing awareness of all of the community members that we have the possibility, not just our community members, but in the Central Ohio area, we have the ability to serve on a daily basis, and making sure that we lean into that training in the future.
That's great. Thank you so much, Chief. Before we say goodbye, Jamil, Sammy, Deidre, do you have anything else? Well, Chief, I just want to thank you on behalf of the subcommittee for coming speaking to us this evening. You have been just such a knowledgeable a source for this group to get a better understanding of what we do as a community, and your experience is definitely appreciated.
Thank you for the time. I really do appreciate it, and certainly for Jamil and Tammy, if you ever want to reach out, certainly you have license to call me. If you ever want to come by and get a tour of the police department, or just sit down and talk more about what your thoughts and experiences have been on the community task force, or want to know more about what we're doing on the advisory committee, I'd be happy to spend the time with you for sure. Audrey got pulled away. I've known Audrey since she was in middle school. She ran with our second oldest for cross country for several years, and so I want to offer the same openness to both of you. If you ever have any questions, concerns, or want to just provide feedback on from your perspective on things we could be doing as a police department, that's what I'm here for. Is to listen to any member of the community that wants to give feedback on what we should be doing, how we should be doing it, so we can make the right progress in connectivity with all of our community members. So that certainly is an open opportunity to both of you anytime you would like.
Thanks, Chief. All right, so real quick before we wrap up for the evening, I just wanted to review our priority areas before we go into this upcoming community task force meeting, so that we're then able to just give a brief overview of what we talked about. I know that I was supposed to send it to you over the last week. I completely forgot. I'll send you the Word document, I promise. But I just wanted to run through these again and see if you had any new thoughts after the week was up, and to just have a refresher. In summary, we talked last week specifically about youth engagement and having the city need to understand the needs and concerns of youth as a specific stakeholder group. We had talked about needing specifics here. We had also talked about expanding the subcommittee and formalizing it moving forward, so it would branch off from the community task force. We had a conversation about whether or not we could add members into our current organization. Unfortunately, I don't believe that we can, because they would need to be appointed and go through the appointing process and be a part of the task force at large. But we could definitely throw a recommendation in recommending that the city create a formal youth subcommittee that advises either the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board or council at large moving forward. We also talked about working with systems, school systems, recreation, the art, athletics, Centero, to build citywide attractive training opportunities to meet specific demographics and groups that maybe don't just show up at the library for a talk every couple weeks. And then we talked about treating youth as a relevant stakeholder, making sure that the city directly speaks to youth and adheres to their needs. So that's where we were. Did you guys have any thoughts over the week? Some inclusions that you'd like to make? Any other ideas? Hearing none. Sounds like we're hitting the nail on the head. I will send this document to you so that you can keep thinking about it. Once a week during our meetings, I'll just bring it up and we'll have a conversation about it. And one of you, if you don't mind, at the community task force, please report out that we have made this progress and these are the things we're looking into. Do I need to assign one of you to do it, or do you want to volunteer?
Probably do it.
Okay, thank you, Jamil. I will send you both. I will send the entire subcommittee this document just so that you can review it on your own. And then our next meeting is next week at 6. We can debrief from the community task force meeting at large and just talk about maybe what some of the implications of our perspectives are in our priority areas and go from there. So unless you guys have anything, we can adjourn.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Chief. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.